Alright, for this video, I'm going over the USB 800 hazardous drugs handling in healthcare settings FAQ. So your frequently asked questions, they are out for each of the USB chapters, but I found that this one had more highlights, so I'm not going to go through every question, because some of them are just very general. What is a hazardous drug? Things like that, things you would know by now, or depending on how far you are in your pharmacy career, but I'm going to do the highlights for things you might know, not know were emphasized in the FAQ. So you should know that USB plays no role in enforcement. So if that's an answer choice on your USB or on your Mpje, that wouldn't be an answer. Can I do an assessment of risk for an entire group of hazardous drugs, group 1, group 2, group 3, instead of listing each individual hazardous drug? That answer is no. The assessment of risk must list each drug and dosage form individually. What are the alternate containment strategies that may be employed under an assessment of risk? The purpose of an assessment of risk is to identify alternate strategies for handling dosage forms of hazardous drugs to minimize exposure to personnel in the healthcare setting. CSTDs must be used for administration of antioplastic hazardous drugs when the dosage form allows. Where does the designated person obtain training? How much training does a designated person need? Any training should begin with reading the chapter in its entirety. All of the requirements for hazardous drug handling are defined in the chapter, and the chapter provides many references to other source documents. The chapter does not specify a minimum number of training hours. So under facilities and engineering controls, are there requirements for posting signs that hazardous drugs are being handled in the facility? So signs designating the hazards must be prominently displayed before the entrance of the hazardous drug handling areas. Additionally, signs must be available for restricting access to areas where hazardous drug spills occur. Some other information: sterile and non-sterile hazardous drugs may be stored together, but hazardous drugs used for non-sterile compounding should not be stored in areas designated for sterile compounding to minimize traffic into the sterile compounding area. Antioplastic hazardous drugs requiring manipulation other than counting or repackaging of final dosage forms and any hazardous drug active pharmaceutical ingredient must be stored separately from non-hazardous drugs in a manner that prevents contamination and personnel exposure. These hazardous drugs must be stored in an externally ventilated negative pressure room with at least 12 air changes per hour. Non-antioplastic, reproductive risk only, and final dosage forms of antioplastic hazardous drugs may be stored with other inventory if permitted by entity policy. Refrigerated antioplastic hazardous drugs must be stored in a dedicated refrigerator in a negative pressure area with at least 12 ACPHs. Storage room, buffer room, containment, segregated compounding area, your CSCA. So can refrigerated non-antioplastic hazardous drugs be stored with antioplastic hazardous drugs? Yes. A refrigerator must be dedicated to hazardous drug storage and located in the negative pressure room with at least 12 ACPH. Refrigerated antioplastics must be stored in this dedicated refrigerator. Hazardous drug APIs requiring refrigeration must also be stored according to the chapter. Other hazardous drugs may be stored in this dedicated refrigerator or may be stored with other inventory if an assessment of risk has been performed and implemented. So, can refrigerated non-antioplastic hazardous drugs be stored with antioplastic hazardous drugs? Yes. Where should the sink be located? So, care must be taken to locate water source and drains in areas where the presence will not interfere with required ISO classifications. Water sources and drains must be located at least 1 meter away from the containment primary engineering control, the CPEC. Within an IOS classified area, a hand washing sink must be placed in the anteroom at least 1 meter from the entrance to the hazardous drug buffer room to avoid contamination mitigation into the negative pressure hazardous drug buffer room. Within an unclassified CSCA, a hand washing sink must be placed at least 1 meter from the CPEC. and may be either inside the CSCA or directly outside the CSCA. So is the Containment Secondary Engineering Control, the CSEC, required to be externally vented through high efficiency particular air (HEPA) filtration (HEPA)? No, the CSEC must still be externally vented, but it's not required to go through the HEPA filter. All CPECs used for manipulation of sterile hazardous drugs must be externally vented. ISO 5 class or better air quality. Class 2 BCS types A2, B1, or B2 are acceptable. CPECs used for pre-sterilization procedures such as weighing and mixing must be either externally vented or have redundant HEPA filters in series and must provide personnel and environmental protection such as Class 1 BSC or Containment Ventilated Enclosure CVE, or Class 2 BCS or a CAC1 may be used. Next question, can non-hazardous drugs and hazardous drugs be compounded in the CPEC located in the same CSEC? Separate rooms are required for sterile, non-sterile hazardous drugs and non-hazardous drug compounding with 2 exceptions. So typically, the rule is you have to have 2 separate rooms, but for entities that compound both non-sterile and sterile hazardous drugs, the respective CPECs must be placed in separate rooms unless those CPECs used for non-sterile compounding are sufficiently effective that the room can continuously maintain ISO 7 classification throughout the non-sterile compounding activity. They can be placed at least 1 meter apart, and particle generating activity must not be performed with powders when sterile compounding is in process. Another exception, a BSC or CAC1 used for preparation of hazardous drugs must not be used for the preparation of non-hazardous drugs unless a non-hazardous drug preparation is placed into a protective outer wrapper during removal from the CPEC and is labeled to require PPE handling precautions, personal protective equipment. So can the laminar airflow workbench, LAFW, or compounding aseptic isolator, CAI, be used for compounding non-antioplastic hazardous drugs? So the LAFW cannot be used for compounding an antioplastic hazardous drug. An LAFW does not provide any protection for the workers from the hazardous drug. An LAFW or CAI may be used for non-antioplastic hazardous drugs. However, alternative containment strategies and or work practices must be determined during the assessment of risk. So this next question, which says the words updated, so could be a research question or it could be a newly accepted question if they ask it. Can a BCS or CAC1 used for compounding hazardous drugs be used to compound non-hazardous drugs? If a non-hazardous drug is prepared in a CPEC or hazardous drugs have been prepared, then the non-hazardous drug must be handled and labeled as a hazardous drug. The non-hazardous drug preparation must be placed into a protective outer wrapper during removal from the CPEC and must be labeled to require PPE handling precautions. All associated materials and wrappers should be discarded as hazardous drug waste because of the preparation and associated materials have potentially been contaminated by exposure to a hazardous drug. Can the negative pressure of the CSEC be reduced or turned off when the room is not in use? No. The CSEC must maintain a negative pressure of 0.01 to 0.03 inches of water column relative to all adjacent areas at all times. Can the air changes per hour in the CSEC be set below the minimum requirement when the CSEC is not in use? No. The CSEC must have the appropriate air exchanges, 12 or 30, at all times. A CACI isolator, robotic device, or similar device may act as a CPEC if it meets the containment requirements of the chapter, as well as the requirements listed in 797. However, the device must be placed in the CSEC, meeting all the requirements in the chapter. Can the CPEC be used to create 100% of the external venting in the CSEC? Yes. If it can do so, yes. The chapter does not require a CSTD for compounding hazardous drugs, although it is recommended. However, the chapter does require the CSTDs be used when administering antioplastic hazardous drugs when the dosage form allows. So the FDA warned against the use of bendamustasiv with CSTDs, syringes and adapters containing polycarbonate or auriclite butadiene styrene (ABS). The component in bendamustasiv, N-dimethylamide (DMA), dissolves the ABS or polycarbonate on contact. So what is meant by fixed walls? Fixed walls are solid, hard, modular, or stick-built construction according to the chapter. Fixed walls are required to prevent the ingress of hazardous drugs and contamination from the CSEC, as well as ingress of contamination into the ISS 7 hazardous drug buffer room. Our pressure gauge is required to monitor the pressure differential. Our pressure gauge is required to monitor the pressure differential between the CSEC and the adjacent areas. So this was also a question in another FAQ. So daily monitoring of negative pressure storage areas and non-sterile compounding areas helps ensure pressure requirements are continuously maintained in these areas. Some environmental and quality control section questions. So the chapter recommends, but does not require, the performance of environmental wipe sampling. If contamination is found, the chapter states that the designated person must identify, document, and contain the cause of the contamination. No standard for acceptable limits for hazardous drug surface contamination. Contamination of any amount indicates a lack of containment and must be addressed. So now we're under the personal protective equipment. 800 requires entities to maintain a list of hazardous drugs that include any items on the current NIOSH lists that entities handle. Gowns shown to resist permeability by hazardous drugs are required when administering injectable antioplastic hazardous drugs. You must also follow the standard operating procedures of the entity. The entity must develop standard operating procedures, SOPs, for PPE based on the risk of exposure and additives performed. Disposable PPE must not be reused. Consider all PPE worn when handling hazardous drugs to be contaminated with, at minimum, trace quantities of hazardous drugs. So after you do that, you have to dispose of it. What documentation is required to show that a gown will resist permeability by hazardous drugs? Testing against ASTM F739. 12. Manufacturers of gowns used for handling hazardous drugs should provide the results of this testing. The gown manufacturer should be able to provide permeability data for commonly used hazardous drugs. Alright, so the next section, thanks to the last one, is under compounding. Some highlights here. The chapter states disposable or clean equipment for compounding, such as mortars and pestles and spatulas, must be dedicated for use with hazardous drugs. Equipment that does not come in direct contact with hazardous drugs may be shared between hazardous drugs and non-hazardous drug compounding areas, provided it is deactivated, decontaminated, and cleaned before it is removed from the hazardous drug areas. APIs or other powdered hazardous drugs must be handled in the CPEC to protect against occupational exposure, especially during particle-generating activities, like crushing tablets, opening capsules, and weighing powder. A question: where should hazardous drug APIs be handled prior to sterilization when compounding sterile hazardous drugs? 797 states that pre-sterilization procedures for high-risk level CSPs such as weighing and mixing shall be completed in no worse than iOS Class 8 environment. For high-risk level hazardous drug CSPs can occur in the hazardous drug iOS Class 7 negative pressure buffer room if the CPEC used for the non-sterile pre-sterilization procedure is sufficiently effective that the room can continuously maintain iOS 7 classification. An iOS Class 7 negative pressure room would be necessary if it leads directly into the hazardous drug iOS 7 negative pressure buffer room. Question: does the chapter apply if the hazardous drug is dissolved in a liquid dosage form and does not become an aerosol or gas? Hazardous drugs that do not require any further manipulation other than counting or repackaging of final dosage forms may be prepared for dispensing without any further requirements for contaminant unless required by the manufacturer, or if visual indicators of hazardous drug exposure hazards are present, dust, leakage, consideration must be given to the aerolation of hazardous drugs in liquid formulations. Hazardous drug CSPs must be filtered in a BSC or CAC1 located in iOS 7 room with negative pressure of 0.01 to 0.03 inches of water and 30 air changes per hour. Question: can an assessment of risk be performed on concentrated solutions of hazardous drugs, hormone concentrations? And that answer is no. Concentrated solutions of hazardous drugs is in hazardous drug API that is further manipulated into the final dosage form and is subject to the contaminant requirements in 800. General Chapter 800 defines an API as any substance or mixture of substances intended to be used in the compounding of a drug preparation, thereby becoming the active ingredient in that preparation and furnishing pharmacological activity or other direct effect of the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease in humans and animals of affecting the structure or function of the body. Cabinets in the non-sterile compounding area must be smooth, impervious, free from cracks and crevices, and non-shedding, but does not limit or define the specific materials that may be used. So I did lie, there are a few more sections, but I only have a few more highlights. So what PPE is required for receiving hazardous drugs? At least one pair of chemotherapy gloves tested to ASTM D6978 standards must be worn when unpacking. Are suppliers required to ship hazardous drug and impervious plastics? No. The chapter recommends that suppliers ship hazardous drug and impervious plastics to segregate them from other drugs and allow for safety in the receiving of the internal transfer process. Does the hazardous drug return waiting area have to be separate from the regular hazardous drug storage area? No, a separate area is not required. Hazardous drugs waiting to be returned to the supplier must be segregated in a designated negative pressure area. The regular hazardous drug storage area may be designated for this purpose. Neat. So the actual last section, label, packaging, transport, and disposal. What must be on the label for hazardous drugs? Hazardous drugs identified by the entity as required special hazardous drug handling precautions must be clearly labeled at all times during their transport. Labeling must be compliant with the appropriate USB standards for compounding, including 795 or 797, and in accordance with acceptable federal, state, and local regulations. So packaging containers and materials must be selected to maintain physical integrity, stability, and sterility of the hazardous drug during transport. Packaging materials must protect the hazardous drug from damage, leakage, contamination, and degradation while protecting healthcare workers who transport hazardous drugs. The entity must have written SOPs to describe appropriate shipping containers and insulating materials. Pneumatic tubes must not be used to transport any liquid hazardous drug or any antioplastic hazardous drugs because of the potential for breakage and contamination. So are personnel involved in waste removal and cleaning required to don PPE? Yes. Personnel must wear appropriate PPE based on their assigned task. So in cleaning, you would actually also wear eye shields. I'm not sure why they didn't go ahead and mention that. So just to reference, your antioplastic drugs are your chemotherapeutics, your chemo drugs, and then the rest are your non-antioplastic hazardous drugs like that appear on the NIOSH list, the NIOSH list. Hormones, antibiotics, well, some of them, obviously not all. Warfarin, antifungals, paroxetine, exenatide, limiptide. You can find those at the end of the hazardous drug abridged section. Alright, thanks for listening. Good luck.